Hello, you're listening to Thinking Social and Solidarity Economy, an online series of presentations and discussions that brings you the people and the ideas that are defining how we can understand a more just and humane alternative to social and economic life. In this episode, you'll hear from Laurie Mook, professor at Arizona State University in the United States. A key figure in the establishment of studies in social and solidarity economy, here she speaks with Professor Marcelo Vieta and an audience of graduate students at the University of Toronto on how she first began to articulate theories of social economy and her most recent thinking.
So Laurie is Associate Director and Associate Professor at the School of Community Resources and Development at Arizona State University, and also Research Associate at the Lodestar Center for Nonprofit Innovation and Philanthropy. So prior to moving to Arizona, Laurie was, sorry, I'm reading your official bio here, so it says Laurie was here at AECD, as she just said. She is a graduate of our program, PhD graduate, and she was a co-director of the Social Economy Center. Now, the Social Economy Center, for those of you that have been poking around, the AECD website was a precursor to the Center for Learning, Social Economy and Work. So when Jack Quarter was with us, and I just got hired, we merged the Social Economy Center with the Center for Learning at Work. And so it became the Center for Learning, Social Economy and Work. It's the same center, but it's got an additional work aspect to it explicitly. And we have archives dating back to when Laurie was here. So Laurie is co-author of What Counts, Social Accounting for Nonprofits and Co-ops, Understanding the Social Economy, which you're reading, and Understanding the Social Economy of the United States. These are both really innovative texts. They're one of the first texts that kind of bring the social economy together. And Laurie was also involved, and I'll get, Laurie, this is something you're going to get into, but Laurie was involved in articulating the social economy during the 2000s, the concept in Canada in a big research project that happened then. And she's also the editor-in-chief of the Association for Nonprofit and Social Economy Research. So I'll let Laurie kind of like the questions that I'm going to ask her and her answers. She'll show you the expertise that she has. And we're so glad to have you here today. Thank you so much for doing this, Laurie. We know you're super busy.
No, this is great. And it's so nice to be able to join you by Zoom. I'm not a great traveler, so I've really been taking advantage. We were talking about the sort of the positive sides of Zoom. And I guess if the COVID pandemic is that, you can go to international conferences and just be in your home.
Yeah, exactly. And then have you in our, and also have you in our class.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, enjoying classes.
So that's great. I have some questions, but do you want to just?
Yeah, I'll just start with a little bit more about myself. So I'm in Arizona, in Tempe, for Phoenix, Arizona State University. I've been here about 13 years, coming from the University of Toronto, from your department. I also want to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples called the Acamel Odom and the Peepash peoples, and have, as you probably know, lovely weather all year round, pretty hot in the summers, but I certainly don't miss the snow and the cold, that's for sure. So prior to my academic career, I also wanted to mention that I had a professional career. I had a professional accounting degree in Canada. That was my first stint. And then I decided that working in the corporate sector wasn't really for me. I wanted to do something that was using my talents and energies to give for a wider impact than just the shareholders of a corporation. So I took a few months off. I did some traveling. I went over and backpacked around Southeast Asia, India, some other places, Indonesia. My mother was from Indonesia, so that was my original impetus for wanting to travel and just to see where she had grown up. And from that, it's a pretty big trip. So I decided to stay a bit longer and went all across, traveled all through. And that really opened up my eyes to community, quality of life and all of this. And it was one of the key moments in my life. When I came back, I decided I was 29. I started my undergraduate career at the University of Guelph in international development. And then also had the opportunity to participate in a study abroad program in Krakow, Poland, at the time that the Berlin Wall was coming down. So that was also another exciting experience. From there, I did my master's at the University of Alberta in educational foundations and policy studies, and then met my husband there. We got married, and he got a visiting teaching position at the University of California in Los Angeles. So we moved there for a few years, had a couple of kids, and then he got a position at the University of Toronto, and we made our way back there. And once both my kids were in kindergarten, I decided to start my doctoral degree. So but also that works into how I got into this field to begin with. There was a student in the department who was working with Jack Corder, who was doing her PhD thesis on social auditing in nonprofit organizations. So they asked me, because they knew I had an accounting background, asked me to review the dissertation. I had lots of comments to make, and that's how I met Jack. And we started working together. So it was prior to me starting my doctoral studies. But because I had this background in accounting, had done all this traveling, and was interested in community development, kind of brought all those fields together. So that's my initial sort of entry into this field.
That's amazing. I can relate to that, because I started university late, not in my 20s as well, my undergrad. And when I finished my undergrad, in communication, I went to work at TELUS for 4 years. So I was middle manager at TELUS doing community stuff, but it was more corporate social responsibility stuff. And I also didn't want to stay in the corporate world and wanted to explore more the community. That really grabbed me. So then that's when I did my master's and PhD. So that's interesting. I wonder how many scholars or people in the social economy started that way. So
we find a lot of people in nonprofits in general are studying nonprofits, which is the school. I'm in the School of Community Resources and Development, but teach in the nonprofit leadership and management program. And most students kind of find it by accident, or they're older and they come back, they want a second career or so forth, because it isn't something that you're really, too much about in high school, or that your career counselors are driving you towards.
Yeah, that's true. So, that's very true.
It's only once you get out and have some experience, and find out about all this other stuff that kind of falls into place.
That is a good point. Yeah. And I find that some people that take this course and some other courses don't know much about the social economy, and then are really taken by it after. So that's also great. So let me I have some questions for you, just to. Okay. Just to see how it is that the book came about, and how because we're at this point this is week 2. So we're looking at definitions and conceptual foundations of the social economy, and comparing and contrasting different concepts and ways of understanding it. So we're reading your first chapter in conjunction with some other introductory texts on the social economy, social and solidarity economy. So let's start from the beginning. How did the book Understanding the Social Economy come about?
All right. So this is actually there was a book before that, that Jack and this student that I had talked about, that I was working with her on her dissertation, Betty Jane Richmond, and I worked on before I started my program, but it's called What Counts? Social Accounting for Nonprofits and Cooperatives. And I had been working on developing social accounting models, which we can talk a little bit about if anybody's interested later on. But we had published this in the book, and there was a chapter on the social economy. So that was kind of building on Jack's work, which he had actually written a book in 1992 on Canada's social economy, and done some research in the early 2000s about developing this framework. So we continued to work on it and fine tune it and develop it. And then there was an opportunity through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council to get a large grant. It was a 5-year grant based all across Canada. We were in charge of the Southern Ontario bit, but we, along with that, we did the Social Economy Center was built from there, and we started the there's an academic association and a journal and so forth. So that all came out of that big grant. But then we were looking for a way to put all this together. There was a need for, as you say, Marcelo, not many people had heard about the social economy or knew what it was. So especially we were also interested in targeting business schools as well. So we decided there was nothing really as a textbook for Canadian, a Canadian-based textbook in this area. So we decided that was kind of our first big step in moving forward. So we worked with Anne Armstrong, who ran a social entrepreneurship program out of the Rotman School at University of Toronto, the business school. So we worked together on the first edition of the social economy book for Canada, Canadian Perspective, which is now, I assume you're using the second edition of that. And we also, once I started working in the US, we also wrote a US version of the book, Understanding the Social Economy in the United States. So that's kind of the beginnings. It comes out of that research. There was an emphasis of the government at that time on social economy. It was a liberal government. Paul Martin was also spearheading some of this work, a former prime minister. And so that's how the work started. And then we brought in it. So the book not only describes what our version of the social economy framework that we use, which is more of like a taxonomy. It's sort of a tool to look at the social economy and how different parts of it interact. But then we also included some, the second part of the book is on management issues and issues that are unique to social economy organizations, where you'll find a chapter on social accounting, on financing, on governance, and so forth.
Great. So how did you decide to write the book? Was it because of the research that you were doing in the Social Economy Hub, and then you decided, or was it like, let's start from scratch, or how did that decision to write a textbook come about?
It was at the time of the research, so it was generally, how can we sort of target the widest audience and get all this information put together in one book? We had approached a couple of different publishers, and then finally decided on the University of Toronto Press to publish the book. But it's just because that was kind of the jargon of the deck, those years, and the new concept in the Canadian, especially the English Canadian context. There was still a lot of work in Quebec, and it is slightly different in the Quebec context. And you'll find that as you read different articles on social economy, social solidarity, there's going to be different perspectives of what's included, what's not included, the purpose of the frameworks and where they developed, and how they account for different impacts. But yes, so I would say I'm coming out of working on that at the Social Economy Center, just sort of the main focus of the center and the work kind of led to the book.
Yeah. And the book relies a lot on case studies, which is really rich. It's really rich in illustrating, and you
that was a fun part.
Yeah.
Of writing the book as well, is to connect with all these different organizations and people and talk about different issues and include these little snippets in the book, and then the bigger case studies at the end of the chapters. Yeah,
and you had students help out with that too, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's really good. That's an opportunity that some of you might come up.
Well, I was a student at the time as well. So.
Oh yeah, you're a student too. Yeah. So yes. Yeah. So so the book uses an integrative and bridging concept, which is really useful, I think, for teaching, especially for introducing the social economy. And how's it been received in your view over the years?
I would say it's more common in Canada. From the US, it's very new concept. The US, I would say there's less knowledge of it. The people who have come across it really identify with it, but there's also a strong inclination to stay with these three separate sectors: the nonprofit sector, study it as an entity on its own, and so forth.
Like a third sector.
Yeah, a third sector.
Yeah.
So, we look at it, we use this, the Venn diagram that you'll come across in the book several times as a tool, sort of a heuristic of looking at how organizations come together and work in a mixed economy. So it's a way of perhaps you could use it as if you're doing research, for example, as a unit of analysis would be each component of the social economy framework. And then you could examine, the size and scope, the impact, who's included, who's not included in different sections, and so on. So although in the diagram it's portrayed as equal circles, it's really, that's not the reality. Each part of it is different sizes and in different regions, in different countries, with different logics and so forth. But it's just a way of categorizing organizations so that you can look at them in a slightly different way. Yeah, and understand how the pieces work together to create the type of society we have today. So, but on the other side, it's also really important to keep in mind that to understand the society as we have it today, there's a lot of exploration to be done around power relations, around racism and so forth. Like, again, who's included, who's excluded, and what are the factors that lead to that?
Yeah. That's perhaps, and not, this is not meant to be a critique, but it's perhaps an area that's that's not looked at as deeply in the book, but you can only do so much, right? And you are
right.
An overall presentation.
It is kind of the first step, and as I say, it's a tool, right? It's just a way of categorizing. So the next step would be to take that tool as a researcher and then use that as a way of analyzing data.
Yeah, which I have and others have, by the way. So it's been an amazing entry point into the social economy, and I've been using it as an entry point to work in Latin America, and then looking at other dimensions, perhaps, or other kind of degrees of, and putting in power relations and other. So it's really useful that way as a starting,
and including like what we talk about as the solidarity economy too, which is another framework, which perhaps could be thought of as a subset of the social economy, happening more in the sort of the civil society sector. But it's a way of, again, if you understand what's included and what's not included in the different sections, and then how people are coming together. Again, it's just it's another tool for trying to understand those phenomena.
Yeah, I include it in the civil society week, and then we talk about social and solidarity economy and that, and look at other kind of complementary dimensions too. So talking about that, how do you think the model compares to other conceptualizations, social and solidarity? So increasingly, you're seeing social and solidarity economy. Especially with those involved in social movements. In the US, it's SSE with social movements, right? In Latin America, or even, I just saw that Caroline Hossain, who we were reading several pieces, we're reading 2 articles of hers. She just came out today with a piece on why it should be the solidarity economy, and actually uses, I just saw this, actually.
Yeah, I read it too. And that's why I think perhaps I have a different reading of it.
Yeah.
More that the solidarity economy is part of the social economy. It's not two same things. It's used for different purposes.
I agree. Caroline's getting a little bit more, critical, I think, in her writing, which is fine, which is great. But it's
great to invoke discussions about what is the social economy, what is social economy, solidarity economy, what's the purpose of understanding different perspectives, and then to look at different concepts. Because in Europe, again, there's different concepts as to what social economy organization is, or a social enterprise is, social entrepreneurship. Again, what are the factors that contribute to you being within that particular category or not. Our conception is very broad. It covers a lot of things, where other conceptions are more slices, I would say, and sometimes have the same terminology, so it does get confusing a little bit, and people think you're comparing apples to apples, but it's really maybe not.
And some conceptualizations say, and I don't agree with this, say any market activity is not part of a social economy. Others say that the what you call public sector nonprofits, that those are really, it's the state, it's a public sector, isn't really part of the social economy. But you can't argue that the University of Toronto or a hospital doesn't have many elements of it that are part of the social economy. So I really appreciate that. While in Europe, that wouldn't be considered part of the social economy. It would be considered part of the public sector, much more of a welfare state and a beginning point there. So it's interesting how that, and that's
Yeah,
what we're
and so
trying
you
to.
see the importance of defining what you mean by your
Yes.
term straight off the bat, so folks know exactly what you're talking about and don't make assumptions or incorrect assumptions about what the results of a research might be or what you're talking about.
Yeah. And something I think important, and so these are some of the debates and discussions and that we'll be having throughout the course for everybody.
Yeah.
And also, I feel free to ask questions, by the way, too.
Yes,
we didn't say
please
that.
do.
Yeah, because it's nice to have a conversation with Laurie, but this is just to get the conversation going. So I wanted to say, oh yes, how do you think, because community economic development is really important in Canada, especially that the term also emerges in Canada in part. And I know you've done work in that field as well. And you also co-taught the CED course with Jack, right? Did you, or was that?
Yeah, I don't recall. Names or numbers of courses are beyond me at this point.
The community development innovative models, or was that Sharita that co-taught?
I think that was Sharita. Yes.
Yeah. So how do you think because you have a section called, there's a part of the social economy in your model that's community economic development. So how does that compare to some of our students will be taking that course? So how is that complementary to the social economy model?
Yeah, so I think that's the part of the sort of the Venn diagram that can intersect with both the state and the private sector.
Yeah.
So it's just a way of looking at, you want to look at all the stakeholders involved perhaps are different, and how to manage how that combination of stakeholders kind of comes together to create economic development in the community.
Yeah. So I have one more question, and then we'll open it up to the class. And then, Laurie, if you want to talk about any other elements, any other things that we haven't talked about. But I know that you've recently about a year now, you've been the chief editor of the Journal of Nonprofit and Social Economy, the Canadian Journal of Nonprofit and Social Economy Research, which Jack co-founded with you and others. And it's also linked to an association whose conference is coming up, by the way. And on Friday, if any of you are interested, Friday is the due date for for a paper proposal. Yeah, yes. Which you're all invited to do. Maybe you'll be extending that deadline. I don't know, but
it's already been extended. I think this is the.
This is the extension. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the extension.
That conference, together with a sibling organization called the Canadian Association for Studies and Cooperation, which Jack was also central in co-founding. It will be in Toronto at the end of May. The other thing I wanted to mention, this all relates to my question. CASI, which is and I wanted to also give you all a heads up, the Canadian Association for Studies in Adult Education. They're all related, and most of us present in all three of those, especially in AACD, all three of those associations and conferences. They're all happening at the end of May. CASI is happening at OISE. So it's May, I think, I'll send you all the link to the class, but it's the last 2 days of the business week of May into the weekend, CASI. And on the Friday, I think the 29th of May, we'll be holding our first inaugural Jack Quarter lectureship on the social economy. Professor George Melnick, who's an emeritus professor at the University of Calgary, when Jack passed away, bequeathed some money to do this annual lectureship honoring Jack on the social economy. We haven't been able, we were going to do it in 2020, the first one, and then the pandemic hit, and so we had to cancel it. So, and really important for that. So George Melnick said, I'm going to give you this money. I want you to do an annual lectureship, but it's got to be at OISE. It's got to be at OISE because I'd like Jack's memory to stay alive at OISE. So that's happening, and I wanted to give you all a heads up there. But all of that, so that was kind of like I was riffing on. I just reminded that I wanted to remind you all of that, and I'll be bringing that up. Opportunities for you to present papers, maybe papers that you've done, or at least be a part of it. And there will be lots of volunteering opportunities, by the way. especially for the Kasai conference. But I wanted to say, okay, so all of that to ask you, Laurie, how you view, what's your vision for the journal, and how has that been working out, and what are your plans for the journal moving forward? How do you see it evolving?
Sure. Well, we just released an issue last week or so, or actually the beginning of January. It was our last issue of 2022. We generally publish 2 regular issues and a special issue that we have funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. They have a special grant called Aid for Scholarly Journals, so that we can remain open source, open access. So it's all free. Authors don't need to pay to publish. Nobody needs to pay to read the articles. But we've been seeing a real increase in submissions, particularly because the outreach to Europe and other parts of the world is really increasing. We're now indexed on several different places that we weren't previously before, like, for example, Scopus, which you may have used in your own research, which is heavily used in Europe. So now we're on Scopus, and we also have I have an editor who works on the French side of the journal who is based in Italy. He was previously in Quebec, but he's based in Italy. So he's really been working on getting, furthering the exposure of the journal. We're going to work on, this year, we'll be working on encouraging authors to disseminate their works, to increase citations, that type of thing. But the other thing we've introduced now, we have research articles. We now have research notes, which are a little bit shorter and not as involved as a research article. And from time to time, we'll have book reviews as well. So anybody is welcome to submit that. I imagine if you're reading a fairly new text, you might as well, if you want to get a little publication out of the way, you could do a book review. And Marcelo used to be the book review editor, so he could definitely give advice on how to put together a good book review. So yeah, we're always looking for submissions. It's an online process. Is pretty streamlined.
Well, Laurie, it's actually it's an option that they have for their final paper. So the final paper, what I call a situated book review. And so they can take a newish book, and I offer a list of them. I try to kind of, put in recent publications, but open to other sources. And then they do a situated book review. So they have to situate it within a literature. And then they take 1,000-word version of that. So just to focus on the book, and they can submit it to, and I always say, the answer, Jay, the journal. And when I was book review editor, I published various reviews from students in this class that way. Okay. So
yeah, we have guidelines on the website as well as to the types of things you'd want to address in a book review.
Yeah, so we can work through anybody interested in that. We can work on that. Well, I wanted to ask if you have any final thoughts about those of us interested in researching, studying the social economy. What can we do with this, both academically but professionally? And then open it up to questions from the class.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think this particular time in our lives we're seeing so many changes that it's just, there's so much to think about and research. So we've got climate change, we've got structural racism and all of those issues, but now we've got a real influence coming from artificial intelligence. And I don't know if you've heard of the ChatGPT chat box. If you haven't, you'd want to look it up. It's pretty amazing what it can do. So we need to start thinking about how is learning and teaching and work in general going to be changing as a result of this pretty dramatic change in the way that we'll be able to think, learn, and ideate. So I think along with that, we also have work being done on distributed ledgers. You probably heard about blockchain and this type of thing. So again, implications for social economy organizations in terms of impact. How do we get resources out to where they're needed pretty quickly without all these middle managers or middle spaces, reducing fraud and so forth. And just there's a lot of work being done actually for volunteer management in blockchain and distributed ledgers, and how to get volunteers out to places as you know, where there's actual need, like to anticipate what the needs are across a geographic area, and then coordinate all of this. So it's just a lot to think about. It's complicated, but in terms of the distributed ledger applications, because on the other hand, there's also environmental concerns because it takes a lot of energy to validate the blockchains and all of this. But if you're interested, actually, I suggest you go to ChatGPT and ask for a simple explanation of blockchain. It's really fascinating. If you haven't seen it already, ChatGPT, you can ask it anything, but then you can also say, okay, write this as a short story, or write this in the style of Shakespeare, you know. If you're doing a paper, like write an outline, it will even write your paper. So there's issues from that side, academic integrity issues as well. But I think what we need to think about is how are we going to use this as a tool? And if you remember, like, this isn't exactly new. If you remember in the field of math, well, you probably don't remember, but they used to use slide rules, and then there was a calculator, and then a graphing calculator, and the math, you know, math became totally different. You know, it kind of elevated everything. So if you think of it in those types of terms, what is going to be elevated? What are we going to, you know, how are we going to use this? And if you have children going to school, they're going to be using it. It's going to be just a whole different way of thinking. And there's a lot of articles now on the educational impact of ChatGPT. It was made public in November, end of November, so December. So it's fairly new. Has anybody here used it, or like just put up your hand if you've heard of it, used it?
I've just learned about it yesterday.
Oh, wow.
An article in The Guardian. I know we can't keep up. I mean, I'm trying to keep up, but it's Nick Cave. Did you read this? Nick Cave. Nick Cave is a really kind of poetic songwriter, UK songwriter, and not mainstream, but he has a huge fan base. So he gets a lot of his fans have been sending him songs in the style of, or whatever it is, Nick Cave. Oh, Australian. Yeah, sorry, not UK. Yes, sorry. Thank you for that correction. Australian songwriter. Anyway, really like avant-garde, just amazing stuff. And in the style of Nick Cave, and he just lambasted it. It's like, this is the most inhuman stuff I've ever. I don't like this, but it's more of a critique of what's to come potentially.
Yep.
So especially to authorship. What does it mean to authorship? Who authors things? And never mind copyright, and obviously, fraudulently claiming your work is yours when it's not, kind of thing. So, but there's also possibilities, as you say, Laurie. So, as any technology, there's a dark side and a possibility side.
Right. And there's new skills, I think, that we'll have to emphasize. So maybe, so it can write essays and all that, but then people need to know how to evaluate sources and fact check and focus more on the critical thinking and problem application side of that. So the writing side, it writes pretty well. And the other thing that I just heard in a podcast today too is that students are using it. So they'll in high school, so they'll have whatever the question is, explain this, but then you can ask it to write it in the style of a sophomore or like a senior in high school, right? So it's going to be more and more difficult to do that. But then if that's the case, what's the next step? What's the next level? So I see there's a few hands. I'll go with Tom. Go ahead, Tom.
Hey, thanks, Laurie. On that note, maybe it'll kind of force us to reevaluate how we do assessments and kind of how we, judge what good work is or not. There's some interesting things there, but I was also just going to say with ChatGPT, one of the funnest things I've been doing with a friend of mine is kind of asking it more meta questions, so about itself actually. So it's actually quite a fun thing to do.
You can interview it too. You can interview ChatGPT, like it has this human language kind of interface, so you can actually hold and as you say, Tom, like ask it what it is, what it's good for, what are your downsides, or whatever.
I was absolutely. I started asking it a series of questions around just kind of value judgments, and it's funny, you can kind of catch it a little bit, because it purports to have, you know, kind of this objectivity in its perspective, but then it'll kind of say something is right or wrong, and you can kind of have it a little bit of a back and forth with it. It's quite fascinating, actually, and it corrects itself. It acknowledges its own shortcomings, and when kind of it's misstated something, it's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's a machine language, so it doesn't really know the content. It just looks for patterns of words around whatever concepts you're looking for. So it will come up with things that are not factual and so forth. So you do have to be careful. It comes up with pretty basic. It writes really well, and it writes in all these different genres. But you have to understand what it can and cannot do. And then, we have to think differently about assessment. So if we allow students to use this as a tool, then what's the next level? Like it might be, okay, you can use ChatGPT to come up to investigate this particular topic, but then you need to teach to the class, what are the 4 most important concepts on this? And it won't give you references either. The references aren't accurate. So you do have to go back and be able to verify and triangulate that information as you would any other information, and acknowledge and cite where the information comes from. So if you're transparent about how you developed these particular ideas, it's great for summarizing things. Like if you've got a paper and you want to do an abstract, just put your paper and says, write me an abstract, and then you're going to fine tune it and whatever, or just summarize this for me, or write this as though, or explain this as though a second grader would explain it, or write it in the form of a short children's story or a play, whatever. It's amazing. So you had your hand just as you start to drink.
Sorry about that. Hi.
Did I pronounce your name right? I'm sorry if I didn't.
You actually did. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So I actually want to go back to something you mentioned in the beginning. So sorry if I'm taking us away from this super interesting conversation. You mentioned that when you wrote the textbook, part of it was meant for business schools, or maybe later you connected it to business schools. And I guess my question has 2 parts to it. I'm going to make a big assumption, but that a lot of times business schools have maybe very different political economic agendas than a school like OISE. And so how was the book accepted? Or if there was any critique around it in regards to, again, political economic approaches, and on your end, why did you want to intend it on some level to business schools? What was your thought process? So maybe the second part, it makes sense to start with, but go with what you feel.
Great. Oh, great question. Thank you. Well, as you know, as I mentioned, I have an accounting background, so I have this affinity for organizational management stuff. And I think because, also as social and environmental responsibility ideas become more mainstream in the corporate sector, there's a way to push that even forward. So I think that there was an impetus. It was the right time to start to push the envelope a little bit more, and work that in. And in terms of the how it was received, I would say more sometimes, generally it's not your typical business school type of topic, but there are some schools and some courses, say in social enterprise, social entrepreneurship is in some programs, in some areas is very hot. So there it's more open. But again, in the early days, we used to give talks at business schools, and it's amazing. Like a lot of it is like finding out about the nonprofit sector by accident. It's like people haven't thought about things in those terms, but once they think about it, it makes sense, and think like, why haven't I, come across this before? That type of reaction. Yeah. Thank you, Stephanie.
Hey.
Thank you for using the hands up too. That makes it easy.
This might be too broad of a question, and you probably talked about it in your book, but I thought I'd just kind of throw it in there. I know I'm a very big proponent for the social economy. I'm really excited to learn about it. But one thing I guess I've heard from, like, for example, some charities here, even in Toronto, if you're familiar with Food Share, a critique a little bit towards the government, not the social economy, is that charities are kind of picking up the slack of government intervention in terms of like minimum wage and housing and lots of other social kind of issues and stuff that we're facing. So how, I guess, is the social economy like assisting this, or maybe kind of almost making it so that the government kind of washes their hands of taking any responsibility for it? Or is it a good thing, I guess? Kind of, like I said, a bit of a broad question.
Right. Okay. So that's an excellent question. And it's even more so here in the US, where the social economy type organizations have to step in places where the government is not. And I think it evokes a very interesting discussion question on are we part of the problem or part of the solution, or both, or how does it work? In terms of, you mentioned Food Share, or food banks are a great example, because we talk about food banks sort of feeding the line, but not doing much work in shortening the line. So how do we manage that? Part of the argument of things not progressing, there's a couple of things. The integration of corporations into the food banking system, because they supply most of the food that goes out to folks. So they've got a vested interest, a business interest actually, in maintaining that. And organizations are, so the board of directors quite often has a very high number of corporate folks. And then accountability, they look at the number of pounds of food or kilograms of food that go through the food bank. So, I mean, what incentive is there to reduce? Really, the sign of a progress would probably be a reduction in the amount of food that's needed, and so forth. We also have the food banking system is highly volunteer based. So I think folks get a false sense of they're doing something to solve the problem, where if we didn't have the volunteers and perhaps they were more focused towards advocating for changes in policies and dealing with things like poverty, minimum wage, structural racism, all of those things, that we could make more progress. So it is a very important question to keep in mind, that always keep in mind, of course, there's a need for, the immediate addressing of needs and so forth, but what can we do what's the root cause of that? And what can we do structurally to start moving the needle away from that? And Canada's way ahead of the US, I would say, in terms of having it's probably getting a little bit worse than when I was there, but the social safety net and all this, there are a lot more programs in Canada than here in the US. So it's fascinating to compare the two different countries. And also fascinating, actually, this is also a point where when you're reading research, quite often people don't acknowledge the different contexts of their study. So you're reading, it's a US-based study, but they're quoting or citing information or providing evidence for arguments based on Canadian studies or UK studies or whatever, but this totally different context, right? And there's nuances there that need to be taken into consideration. You can't just assume that the findings from, as with any article, really, not much is really generalizable to all contexts. Most of it has limitations, but it's really important to acknowledge those as you're putting together your research projects as well.
That's great. These are great questions.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Anybody else?
So this is part of the adult education. Is it the same degree, Marcelo?
Exact same degree.
Okay.
Yeah. And most students are doing the Masters of Education. Some are doing their MA and some are doing their PhDs.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And it's a popular course. It remains a popular course. Yes.
Well, as you know, I did my PhD there, and with Jack Quarter, we used to have a thesis group that we would meet every month. Jack would go down, there's a little cafe down the road. He would bring us back pita hummus sandwiches or something. It was great. It was just such a wonderful experience. And I have such wonderful memories of being at OAZ, and yeah, all the different things we used to organize there. We had usually had our big conferences for the Social Economy Center down in the library space. So we used to move everything around and have that big space to have folks in, which was fun. But yes.
Yeah, we'll be starting that again, well, starting at the end of May, and next year we'll be back to in person. So hoping to do that more often. And we're also, so we have space like the Social Economy Center did, I think, but we are probably going to put in some technology in there. And we're going to share it too with the rest of the department, but it'll be our space. And we're looking forward to that. So we'll be able to do, you know, some interactive, you know, cross comparison research projects and that. So looking forward to that and integrating it to this class as well. Yeah, so we have lots of ideas.
Are many of you already working in a social economy organization, a nonprofit or a cooperative?
Yeah, maybe we can talk about that because we haven't spoken about that in this class yet. Maybe
what kind of, you want to go around and just say what kind of organization you volunteer for or work for, or what your interest is? You, sir?
Yep. So I'm pretty new to this. It's been 6 months of like proper working in Canada, and it started with the nonprofit sector. And the initial seeds of themes similar to this course started with Dr. Sumner's course on the Commons. So I'm a recovering idealist in that sense. I'm realizing the walls have been hitting in being in a government-funded institution. So this course was one of the ways I'm thinking, what type of a career I'll be leading moving forward? Is it okay to go for the food share model, which I was very critical of until I realized this is actually one way to get out of it. Now, my issue is, like, there is the generic question of, is there ever any ethical consumption under capitalism? And is there any use of like being public, private, the spectrum of all the civil society, and the more categories you add, are we really gaining anything? Are we really categorizing the root issue at hand? If it's still going to be a capitalist system that we're just surviving some 50 years into, then we die and repeat the cycle. So very big questions, but the course is triggering all of that. So I don't know what to do, like, moving forward. Do I want to end like nonprofit right where I am, or do I just survive and float like everybody else, some unwaged labor kind of carrying me through, and then maybe, I don't know, I find some model that's relevant. So lots of expectations from the course, but I'm looking forward to to answering that question.
Well, I wish you luck in navigating all of that and the rest of your courses. I found with every new course, I had new ideas and new thinking and so forth. So yeah, it's a journey, but I privileged to be in a program like this too, I think, to be able to think about these things and talk to others as well and have these deep conversations. Thank you. Stephanie.
Hey, I actually work at the Stop Community Food Center in Toronto. Yeah, and I more recently actually, but I think my dream is to do something very similar, but in Thunder Bay with an Indigenous food center. And I think that there is some like different types of initiatives that already exist there. But I'd really kind of like to learn a little bit more about that. And I'm in the MA program, and I'm looking to do culinary placemaking with Indigenous people. So,
oh, that sounds wonderful. And I actually have, there's a book on the Stop. Have you seen it? Yes, I have that. I gave it to one of my students who's doing some work. It's an undergraduate student doing an undergraduate thesis on food insecurity on university campuses. So
that's awesome.
Yes. Sandra.
Hi, Laurie. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My own personal experience, like, I've worked in the nonprofit sector since I graduated university, and like before that as a volunteer as well. So I just like went straight into it. I don't have experience on the corporate sector, but I've worked a lot with corporate partners. And I guess like I'm really interested in the question, and I should say I've worked on always in fundraising, like in that whole fundraising world, and have like gone from a place of like kind of idealism to this place where I'm like, oh my God, like, what are we doing here? And I'm really interested in like I mean, I'd be interested to hear kind of like your ideas, and you know, there might be touching on this in the book as well, but like the charity model in general, and like all of the issues surrounding that, you know, benefits and like real kind of impacts, because we often talk about it in this very the discourse around it is either that it's like amazing, or that there's like some sort of nefarious thing happening in the background where there's like these that like it can go wrong, but when it doesn't go wrong, it's great. But there's very little like kind of critical engagement with like what is this whole overall structure of charity. So yeah, that's kind of like my interest, I guess, in my background. Yeah.
And also remember that the charity sector, nonprofits are not homogeneous. Like there's so many different types. There's arts and culture, there's sports, there's people coming together for different reasons. And then there's the health and welfare and other things as well. So it's a very complicated, but interesting thought experiment to think about.
That's, yeah, sorry. And just to add, like, I think for me, what's really interesting is the actual like act of charity, right? Like, and like totally recognizing all that diversity, but like what, like the power structures involved in like charity, right? And how that kind of makes things happen. So yeah, that's like just another facet of it. But
another fascinating aspect or tangent to that in terms of charity and even cooperatism is the sort of the neurological aspect of it. What happens in our brains when we give and so forth, and why that, you know, that gives us pleasure. And so this is what's called a warm glow feeling. So from that side of things too, it's also an interesting way to think about charity.
Cool.
Cassandra.
Hi, I work for Volunteer Toronto, and I spend my days thinking about the ways in which we depend on unpaid labor for essential services a lot, particularly with food. I've used every course in this degree to think about the ways in which we conceptualize, like you, Sandra, charity, where we think about how people connect, what it means to build a system on the backs of benevolence, particularly food security on the back of benevolence, and what it means when that system collapses, which we've seen it do, I think, in the last few years. And so this course in particular, I'm really thinking about alternative ways of being, what it means to think about things like that we consider human rights, that should belong to the commons, that should belong to everyone, like food, again, because I think about that every day. To think about what it looks like to do it otherwise, what other forms of economy look like in this space.
Yeah, and food seems to be a recurring theme here, food insecurity, all of this. It's a great area to study, to look at all of these concepts. I used to work with Volunteer Toronto, maybe, I don't know, around 15 years ago or so. We used to do workshops there on, I do a lot of work on social accounting, which is also part of the book, and how do you make volunteer contributions visible so that people can start taking notice of them, boards and you know, just, they're an important resource for so many organizations, yet from an accounting standpoint, they're not even recognized. You don't see the degree of volunteer contribution. So that's an area I've developed a social model for.
And if we can't count it, we don't understand what happens, and we don't have that system and the backbone to like, it's one thing in arts and culture where it's really important, but it's another thing, again, with security, advocacy for really important causes. If we don't have that support, a lot of things in a way our society and economy function just collapses.
And here, in addition to food, the big thing is healthcare. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Well, that's a whole other thing. But Tom.
Hi, yeah, I did write in the chat, but I work for an employment help center, or kind of, you could also call it a workforce development agency, at an organization called the Yonge Street Mission, downtown Toronto. And yeah, I've worked in the nonprofit sector, which is the term I use most frequently. Maybe that'll change a little bit in this course, but for about 10, close to 15 years now. kind of like one of the previous people said, since they graduated essentially undergrad. I found myself really interested in this idea of kind of what I've heard called the institutional logics around effectiveness in the work that organizations like mine do. The impact of neoliberal ways of thinking in layering kind of business logic onto kind of making judgments. Are we doing things effectively or not? Not even effectiveness, but just how we build our organizations. So, it was mentioned earlier, I think Laurie, you mentioned boards, including my organization, of directors are full of corporate kind of people. My organization hires its senior executives as of late almost exclusively from out of the private sector. And so I'm really interested in kind of interrogating those logics, I think, as they pertain to, I guess, not just nonprofit sector, but like social economy more broadly. And so I'm still trying to figure out exactly where I want to go with that. But it's something that always comes up kind of even on a day-to-day basis in my work. Like I look at people in senior positions of power making decisions that I can tell that their rationale is coming from a place that's quite different from the experience on the ground that my frontline colleagues have, for example, or the community members have. And why is that happening? How do we allow that to happen? Those sorts of questions. So
yes, a lot of that comes from the accountability movement, I guess, especially through government. If any type of funding, you're spending a lot of time reporting back, creating reports, trying to justify what you did with every single dollar and so forth, which takes a lot of time away from the work you do. Now, this is, if you think about the idea of distributed ledgers and blockchain, this is a way where some of that work would be not even necessary because of the way that system is constructed. There would be far less ability to do anything fraudulent or so forth. And actually you can track how resources move through and that they're used for the purposes they're supposed to be. So that could, as a possible implication for nonprofits, to kind of eliminate that particular function, reporting back to funders. But who knows?
Great.
Yeah. Melissa.
Hi, Laurie. Thanks so much for everything that you've kind of brought with today. It was really, really great and interesting. And yeah, so I, like a lot of people in the class, have been doing nonprofit work since I graduated. For me, that's been over 20 years. So it's kind of a strange thing to think about and reflect upon. I work in the disability space, doing a lot of advocacy work and education, trying to achieve policy change. Haven't done frontline work in a long time. So kind of in that back end kind of area, but making some positive changes as best we can, especially in the context of work, and really getting folks to understand that DEI work includes accessibility, please. If folks who've been in classes with me before are just like, oh, right, it's her again. So it's always me talking about that. Anyway, I also live in a housing co-op, so it's not something that I ever really thought about as kind of similar entities, but yeah, it's going to be very interesting to try and connect some of the things that are really important to me ethically, personally, kind of the things that I believe in, to the theoretical backbone of the class, and a little bit more about the history. And
so do you have to do social labor as part of living in your housing cooperative?
Absolutely. The only reason I'm not on the board right now is because I'm doing this degree. I just don't have time.
I developed my first social accounting model based on a student housing cooperative, WCRI in Waterloo. So it's just.
There's so much work involved in trying to continue the operations, and it's a unique model because it's scattered. So we are a collection of 23 houses in kind of a certain part of Toronto, as opposed to one building. I've lived in other co-ops before, and they've always been apartment buildings. And so this concept just really, it lacks the connectivity that you can bring to the cooperative model in an apartment space. So yeah, we struggle. But
have you come across a book from a while ago by George Sousa? It's on the conversion of Atkinson public housing to a cooperative.
I haven't, but it would be wonderful for that to happen more. And that's something that I've been thinking about over these last 2 weeks, is that housing cooperatives could really kind of fill some of the spaces that we're seeing lacking in housing.
Yeah, you might want to see if you can get a copy. I don't know the exact
Okay.
I
I'll
just,
have a look for
George
it.
Sosa and Marcelo you might have that.
Yeah. I have the book in my office, but I'm going to put it on the chat right now, and I'll make a link available as well. I'm just looking for it right now. But yeah.
Thanks so much, Thibault.
I just wanted to say that it's already an hour. It's been over an hour, Laurie. So I know that I promised you an hour, but obviously you've stimulated a lot of thinking and converse and ideas. So, we'll take you, sir. We'll take your question, and then it's up to you how long you want to stay. We have a bit more time, but if you need to go, I totally get it. We understand.
Sure. Yeah, I'll answer questions if anybody's got questions.
Okay.
So you had your hand up.
Yeah, very quick. So personally, out of all the types of organizations that we can fit within the social economy, what personally is for you like the key ingredient? And we're talking here about how much agency do the members have, the ethical stance that you may or may not align with. Was there like a particular model that really inspired you, and why did it make an impression on you?
Well, for me, and this is something I'm currently working on, I think the most, regardless of the type of organization, it's the ability to create a community within the organization. So a community of the people you're trying to help, or the community of the people who work there. If we've done some work on work integration, social enterprises. So the degree to which you can create a community of folks as they're in these what's called liminal spaces, so in between spaces, where they're going from one career to another. There's all sorts of different ways of looking at liminal spaces, but and what role does communitarianism or communitas play in that? So I think we focus a lot on certain types of impacts, but I think looking at to what degree are we creating community and getting folks connected is going to be an important indicator of how successful we are at accomplishing what we want to accomplish. Great.
Okay, Laurie, again, I'm so grateful to you. Thank you so much for coming to our class.
Welcome. It's a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
We know how really busy you are. And, a lot of us are tired of Zoom and everything, but this is the possibilities that technology opens up. I mean, to have you involved in our class, and I'm so appreciative.
Yes, anytime. And if any of you want to continue a conversation, please reach out. We can do Zoom, we can do email, whatever. If you
we'll be seeing you again in week 11, but a recording of you talking about social accounting.
Okay.
Your presentation that you've prepared. So we'll
but hopefully you'll find that interesting for your volunteers.
So thanks so much, Laurie, and we'll see you soon in Toronto.
Okay, take care. Enjoy the rest of the class.
Bye. Thanks, Laurie.
Bye-bye.
Bye.